begin this section of my evaluation, I will first look at how I have applied the conventions and forms of real media products to my ancillary product tasks. I will first look at how conventions and forms of newspaper poster advertisements have been employed in the creation of my ancillary print advert. These conventions included the centering of the advert around an image, whether it is the background or otherwise, to clearly convey the name of the newspaper the advert is advertising, to display the URL for the newspaper's corresponding website, for the fonts to contrast against the background, and finally for the image or images present to be semiotically associated with the newspaper or what the newspaper is advertising. The advert which I used in a sense as the basis of my product was a Times advert that related to the decreasing amount of fish stocks in the ocean, and the way they adhered to the conventions spoke of above was through framing the background image semiotically to connote the fish stocks being depleted, conveying their newspaper name in a contrasting white font at the focal point of the background image, and then anchoring the image with text explaining the situation of depleting fish stocks, and in turn, through juxtaposition, associating this with the Times newspaper, and hence something they are going to be writing about in their newspaper as a pressing issue. In terms of my advert, I have taken a similar approach to achieving my end result. I have semiotically framed my background image to give visual resonance to my cell line present on the advert and the issue antisocial behaviour, which is the topic of the guide feature I am advertising in this advert. I have clearly conveyed the name of my newspaper in a prominent position on the advert. I use contrasting colours and an opaque underlay to make the text stand out. And finally, I have anchored the image with text that through juxtaposition with my cell line creates the syntagon of advertising my newspaper's agenda, and as such my newspaper, along with clearly identifying the purpose of my advert, which is to promote the guide I spoke of earlier. The only difference between my approach and the Times's, however, is that in order to adhere to other print advert conventions for newspapers, I have also included my corresponding imaginary website's URL in the bottom corner of the advert, as is conventional on print adverts for newspapers. Moving on, I will now discuss how I have employed generic conventions and forms of newspaper radio adverts in order to achieve my end product. Examples of conventions I have discovered around this genre of text include the use of sound effects, concise, fast-paced spoken discourse, equal audio levels, such as pitch, throughout the various speakers of the discourse, and finally the direct denotative mode of address of the newspaper and feature it is advertising. The Manchester Evening News accomplishes adherence to the above conventions in the following ways. They employ sound effects of utensils clattering, the kettle boiling, and cups being placed down in order to connote a kitchen environment. This environment becomes relevant when the newspaper and its job section, aka the feature being advertised, is directly addressed in an equally pitched and concise woman's voice. In my advert, I have adhered to the above conventions in a similar way. I employed sound effects that denote graffiti, police sirens, and bustling high streets in order to connote that the theme of the advert is antisocial behaviour, and to help create a direct peer-to-peer mode of address to the audience as if someone was talking to them about the issue on the street. These connotations are essential in establishing the right mood for the direct address of my newspaper's name and an upcoming contents plug relating to a guide to Antisocial Yorkshire, aka the feature being advertised. Finally, the spoken discourse present for each of the separate speakers is kept to an equal pitch and concise manner throughout, and there is a generally equal pitch across all participants, with the only exception being my voice, which I purposely made prosodically louder in order to make the primary message of the advert, which is to advertise my guide on antisocial behaviour, stand out more in the advert. Finally, I will now discuss how I have employed conventions of real newspapers in the production of my newspaper edition. The main conventions throughout research in relation to newspapers of my two subgenres are the conveyance of a masthead, cell line, dateline box, price, local business advertisements, contents plugs, images anchored by captions, which in the case of my main lead article image was positioned in a predominant position in order to communicate meaning through layout juxtaposition of the story's importance. Headlines, columns, minor stories, contact information, data protection information, page leads, a subversion of linear narrative structures due to the descending importance-based discourse structure of newspaper articles, weather forecast information, and finally, employment of the Pointer OS Text 1 Roman font for the majority of text present in a newspaper, Because my newspaper is a hybrid genre of a local broadsheet, my two bases of conventions and layout for my product were the Times and the Sheffield Star, which ensured I would be able to adhere to both of my subgenre conventions. The way in which they adhered to these conventions varied, as some were only applicable to one of my subgenres. For example, they both incorporate generic conventions such as mastheads, cell lines, dateline boxes, prices, columns, captions, etc. across various editions. However, the Times did not incorporate local business advertisements, being a national paper, and as such relied more towards contents plugs for the advertisements present. In contrast, the Sheffield Star, a local newspaper, relied more on local business advertisements than contents plugs. However, the reasoning behind this is that advertisements make up the majority of revenue for printed publications, and the Star, therefore, a smaller institution, would have to rely more on business advertisements for revenue than a national, much larger institution such as the Times. For my product, as stated being a hybrid product, I incorporated all of the conventions mentioned above, plus more from both subgenres in order to adhere to my hybrid genre. However, as my newspaper was primarily a broadsheet, I tended to favour the Times' advertisement reliance on contents plugs more than the Star's advertisement reliance on local business advertisements, as through research I found this to be the more common type of advert displayed in broadsheets in general, not just in national newspapers. Therefore, although I did include local business advertisements to adhere to subgenre convention, I did so in a marginalised manner, meaning that my newspaper was more reliant on contents plugs than local business advertisements. To conclude, finally, the last difference in my adherence to the above conventions from my two base models was that my masthead had to be a hybrid in itself of a broadsheet and local newspaper masthead. This therefore meant that my masthead has incorporated the traditional features of a broadsheet masthead whilst at the same time incorporating the mise-en-scène element of colour in the colour red, as this is iconographic semiotically of my target demographic area. And as John Hartley suggested in 1987, an institution needs to enter a relationship with its audience for it to be successful in its mode of address. This was an essential part of my masthead and turned newspaper creation in relation to the targeting of my demographic, while combining different subgenre conventions.